On the morning of 10th of June, 1944, as distant battles in Normandy promised liberation, the villagers of Oradour-sur-Glane moved through their Saturday routines unaware of the approaching column of German vehicles. Marie Lambert, 37 years of age, a baker's wife with 3 young children, hung laundry in her garden as the first military trucks rumbled over ancient cobblestones. The midday bells had just fallen silent when soldiers in field gray uniforms surrounded the village square, their boots echoing against stone walls that had stood for centuries. What followed became the most methodical civilian massacre in Western Europe, a ritual of cruelty so precise it transformed a peaceful French hamlet into an eternal monument to calculated brutality. This is the story of how 642 souls perished in a single afternoon, and how the blackened ruins of Oradour came to whisper warnings that still chill the blood 8 decades later. Subscribe now to discover the haunting truth of what actually motivated the Waffen-SS to obliterate an entire community in the dying days of occupation. The early summer air hung heavy with the scent of ripening orchards and fresh bread as Oradour-sur-Glane stirred to life on that fateful Saturday morning. Located in the Haute-Vienne department of central France, 22 kilometers northwest of Limoges, the village embodied rural French tranquility, a place where time seemed to move more slowly than in the war-torn cities. Stone houses with red-tiled roofs lined narrow streets that converged on a modest village square dominated by a Romanesque church built in the 12th century. Chestnut trees provided shade for elderly men who gathered to smoke pipes and discuss the advancing Allied forces they had heard about on clandestine radio broadcasts. Women moved between homes and the village bakery, exchanging news in hushed tones, while children played with wooden toys crafted by local artisans. The village had largely escaped the worst hardships of the German occupation. While food rationing affected everyone in France, the rural location allowed residents access to local produce and dairy that city dwellers could only dream about. Most villagers maintained small garden plots behind their homes, growing vegetables and herbs that supplemented the meager official rations. The community had developed the cautious pragmatism common throughout occupied France. They kept their heads down, complied with regulations, and focused on daily survival rather than resistance. Roger Godfrin, 8 years old, sat at his desk in the village school, fidgeting as he watched sunlight dance across the wooden floor. The son of refugees from Lorraine in eastern France, he had been evacuated to this quiet village where the war seemed a distant concern. His teacher, Marguerite Roufanche, 47 years of age, tapped her ruler against her desk to regain the attention of her restless students. She had just begun a lesson on French geography when the distant rumble of engines drew her gaze toward the window. "Children, please continue with your exercises," she instructed calmly, though her heart had begun to race. The sounds of military vehicles had become a warning signal throughout occupied France, a harbinger of potential danger. She moved to the window, her slender fingers pulling back the thin curtain just enough to glimpse the road. What she saw made her blood run cold, a column of German trucks and half-tracks turning into the village, soldiers in distinctive camouflaged uniforms sitting stone-faced in the back. These were not the regular Wehrmacht soldiers who occasionally passed through on patrol. These men belonged to the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, an elite formation of the Waffen-SS that had been positioned near Toulouse in southern France when the Allied forces landed at Normandy 4 days earlier. Now they were moving northward to join the fight, their journey marked by escalating brutality in response to French resistance activities. Their distinctive helmet insignia, the dual lightning bolts of the SS, identified them as members of a force known for ideological fanaticism and unrestrained violence. The Das Reich Division had a particularly bloody history, even by SS standards. Formed in 1939, the unit had served extensively on the Eastern Front, participating in brutal anti-partisan operations in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, where entire villages were routinely annihilated in pacification campaigns. Many of the officers and men had been indoctrinated at special SS training facilities, where racial ideology and unflinching brutality were instilled as virtues rather than vices. By the time they were transferred to southern France in early 1944, they had developed efficient methods for eliminating civilian populations deemed hostile or expendable. Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, 39 years of age, stood in the lead vehicle, his face impassive as they entered the village. Tall and lean, with sharp features hardened by years of warfare on the Eastern Front, Diekmann embodied the SS officer archetype, educated, disciplined, and utterly committed to National Socialist principles. A former university student with a passion for medieval history, he had joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS 2 years later, rising through the ranks with a reputation for unwavering dedication to ideological objectives. Earlier that morning, Diekmann had received reports that a Waffen-SS officer, Major Helmut Kempfe, had been captured by French resistance fighters reportedly operating from Oradour. Kempfe was not merely a fellow officer, but Diekmann's personal friend, someone with whom he had served since the early days of the war. The intelligence was flawed, confusing this peaceful village with another similarly named settlement, Oradour-sur-Glane, several kilometers away where resistance activity had indeed been reported. But Diekman was not a man to question orders or intelligence once a course of action had been determined. "Secure the village," he ordered as the vehicles ground to a halt in the square. "No one leaves." His French was clinical and precise, learned during university years before the war, had transformed him from a scholar of medieval history into an instrument of Nazi occupation policy. The village mayor, Paul Desourteaux, 70 years of age, emerged from the town hall, his weathered face betraying concern, but not yet terror. A veteran of the Great War who had survived the trenches at Verdun, he approached the German officer with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to negotiating with occupying authorities. "Monsieur," he began, addressing Diekman with formal politeness, "how may I assist you? Our village has always maintained proper relations with German authorities." Mayor Desourteaux had, throughout the occupation, walked the delicate line between protecting his community and avoiding actions that might provoke German reprisals. Diekman regarded him with cold efficiency. "There will be an identity check and search for weapons. Assemble all residents in the market square immediately." His tone left no room for questions or objection. "All residents, understand? Men, women, children, everyone." As the mayor reluctantly nodded and turned to comply, church bells began to ring across the village. Not the measured tolling that marked the hours, but an urgent, continuous peal that served as a warning. Diekman glanced sharply at a subordinate, who nodded and dispatched 3 soldiers toward the church tower. The bells fell silent minutes later. The elderly bell ringer dragged roughly down the narrow stone stairs to join his neighbors in the square. Throughout Oradour, the SS troops moved with practiced efficiency, entering homes, shops, and the small hotel near the square. They remained calm, almost courteous, as they instructed villagers to gather in the central market square. This apparent civility would later be recognized as something far more sinister, the calculated procedure of men implementing a predetermined plan rather than acting in the heated passion of combat. In the Deschets household, Francine, 26 years of age, was preparing lunch for her husband André and their 2 young daughters when pounding at their door startled them. The scent of simmering potato soup filled their small kitchen, a simple meal stretching scarce ingredients as all French households had learned to do during the occupation years. 2 SS soldiers stood on their threshold, rifles at the ready. "To the square, immediately," the taller one commanded in broken French. "Bring identification papers only, nothing else." "My children are napping," Francine protested, gesturing toward the back room. "The youngest is only 7 months old." "All residents," the soldier repeated, his voice hardening. 5 minutes, or we come back." The implied threat hung in the air as they moved to the next house. André Deschets, 31 years of age, pulled his wife close. "We must comply," he whispered urgently. "Remember what happened in Toul yesterday?" News had reached them of reprisals in the nearby town, where the SS had hanged 99 men from lampposts and balconies in response to resistance attacks. The brutal images of bodies swinging in the summer breeze had traveled quickly through the countryside, carried by witnesses who had fled the atrocity. Francine nodded, swallowing her fear as she moved quickly to wake the children. Little Simone, 4 years of age, rubbed sleep from her eyes and asked innocently, "Are we going to a party, Maman?" The question, so incongruous with the reality they faced, caught in Francine's throat. She managed only to shake her head as she bundled the infant Jean into a light blanket, uncertain when, or if, they would return to their home. Throughout the village, similar scenes unfolded as families were roused from their homes. Some arrived in the square still wearing aprons or work clothes, having been interrupted in the midst of their Saturday tasks. Farmers who had been working in outlying fields were rounded up by motorcycle patrols and escorted back to the village center. By 1:30 in the afternoon, nearly the entire population of Oradour stood clustered in the market square under the watchful eyes of armed SS troops. The atmosphere remained tense, but not yet terrified. Many villagers believed this was simply another identity check, an inconvenience of occupation they had experienced before. Some even brought small parcels of food, anticipating a few hours' detention before return to their homes. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, uncomfortable in the summer heat, but not yet aware of the horror that awaited them. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Sturmbannführer Diekman emerged from the town hall where he had established a temporary command post. He conferred briefly with his subordinates before addressing the assembled villagers. "Men and boys will be searched for weapons," he announced through an interpreter. "They will move to the barns at the edge of the village. Women and children will remain in the church for their own safety until the search is completed." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. The separation of families was unusual and frightening. Husbands exchanged worried glances with wives. Teenage sons looked questioningly at fathers. But surrounded by armed soldiers, there was no choice but compliance. The crowd began to divide along the lines dictated by the German officer. Robert Hebres, 19 years of age, kissed his mother and sisters goodbye, not knowing this would be the last time he would see them. "We will be home for dinner," he reassured them with a confidence he did not feel. Decades later, as one of the few survivors, he would recall this moment as the last normal exchange of his youth, the final conversation before the world descended into madness. Some families attempted resistance to the separation. Madame de Pique, 62 years of age, refused to let go of her husband's arm, declaring through tears that they had never been parted in 43 years of marriage. An SS soldier struck her with his rifle butt, the crack of impact silencing the surrounding crowd. As she crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from her temple, her husband was shoved roughly toward the group of men. The men and boys, approximately 200 in total, were divided into 6 groups and marched to different locations. René Poutereau's barn, the Lodi garage, the Milord barn, the Beaulieu garage, and 2 additional barns on the outskirts of the village. The women and children, numbering around 440, were directed toward the stone church, its Romanesque architecture offering what they believed would be temporary sanctuary. Inside the Lodi garage, Robert Hebris stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors and friends, including his father. The building, normally used for storing farm equipment, was barely large enough to contain the 60 men crowded inside. The air grew stifling as they waited in anxious silence, listening to the sounds of German soldiers positioning machine guns outside. The scent of oil and metal hung in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of fear-induced sweat. "They cannot mean to harm us," whispered Marcel Bernard, a shopkeeper in his 50s. "The village has never supported the resistance. We have always complied with occupation regulations." Hebris's father shook his head grimly. "This is different," he murmured. "These are not the regular army. These are SS." As a veteran of the Great War, the elder Hebres recognized the methodical preparations for what they were: the positioning of machine guns, the careful spacing of guards, the systematic separation of the population. These were not the actions of men conducting a routine search operation. One of the younger men, Pierre Renaud, 16 years old, began to sob quietly. "I should have run when we first saw them. I could have reached the woods." "And they would have shot you on sight," an older man replied softly, "and then killed 10 more of us in reprisal. That is their way." At precisely 3:15 in the afternoon, without warning or provocation, the SS troops opened fire on the men gathered in each location. The methodical nature of the massacre became immediately apparent. The soldiers had positioned themselves to direct maximum fire into the crowded buildings, using machine guns mounted on tripods for optimal efficiency. In the Lodi garage, the first burst of automatic fire cut down the men standing in the front rows. Those behind fell in successive waves as bullets tore through the packed bodies. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. The mechanical chatter of the MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, mixed with the impact of bullets striking flesh and bone, the screams of the dying, and the shouts of the SS troops. Robert Hebras felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his leg, then found himself buried beneath the falling bodies of his neighbors. Instinctively, he remained motionless, blood from those killed outright soaking into his clothing. The copper smell of blood filled his nostrils, and the weight of corpses pressed him against the dirt floor, making each breath a struggle. The gunfire continued for several minutes, sweeping methodically across the prone bodies. Then came single shots, SS troops moving among the fallen, delivering coup de grace to any who showed signs of life. Through slitted eyes, Hebers watched an officer move from body to body, pistol extended, firing into the heads of the wounded. When the officer approached his position, Hebers held his breath, lying perfectly still beneath the protective weight of the dead. "À l'état," the officer announced clinically. "All dead," before turning to leave the garage. But even as the SS troops withdrew, they implemented the next phase of their plan, setting fire to the building to eliminate evidence and ensure no survivors. Smoke began to filter through the garage as straw and fuel were ignited against the exterior walls. Similar scenes played out in the other 5 locations, where the village men had been gathered. In Poutereau's barn, the SS troops added another layer of cruelty to the massacre. After the initial shooting, they covered the wounded and dead with straw and set it ablaze, burning alive those who had survived the gunfire. The screams from inside the burning building could be heard throughout the village, a sound so terrible that even some of the SS troops were seen to flinch. Aimé Renaud, 37 years of age, had fallen beneath several bodies in Milord's barn. Like Hebres, he feigned death as the SS conducted their inspection of the victims. When fire was set to the barn, Renaud managed to crawl toward a small opening in the rear wall, dragging himself through it despite a bullet wound in his shoulder. He reached the cover of a hedgerow just as flames began to consume the building, carrying with him the sounds of his dying neighbors, sounds that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. Only 5 men would survive the massacre of the male villagers, each escaping through extraordinary circumstances and chance. Their survival would later prove crucial in piecing together the events of that terrible day and ensuring the story of Oradour would not be forgotten or distorted. While the men were being executed, the women and children waited inside the village church, unaware of the fate befalling their husbands, fathers, and sons. The ancient stone building, which had stood as a place of worship and comfort for generations, was about to become the site of an atrocity that would defy comprehension. Marguerite Roufanche, the schoolteacher, stood near the altar with her daughter and two small grandchildren. Around her, mothers attempted to quiet fussing infants and keep restless children occupied during the long wait. The church, designed to hold perhaps 300 worshippers, was overcrowded with approximately 440 women and children. The atmosphere inside was tense, but still relatively calm. Most believed this was a temporary measure while the Germans conducted their search for weapons. The interior of the church was cool despite the summer heat outside, its thick stone walls providing insulation. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the worn stone floor where generations of villagers had knelt in prayer. The scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals hung in the air, familiar and comforting even in this moment of uncertainty. Madame de Sureau, the mayor's wife, attempted to organize the children, leading them in quiet songs to keep them calm. Her voice, though trembling slightly, carried the melody of Frère Jacques through the ancient nave. Some of the youngest children joined in, their high voices echoing against the vaulted ceiling, creating a surreal contrast to the circumstances that had brought them there. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 SS soldiers entered the church carrying a large wooden box, which they placed in the center of the nave. They withdrew quickly, sealing the heavy wooden doors behind them. Within moments, a thick, acrid smoke began pouring from the box, an incendiary device designed to create panic and suffocation rather than immediate death. "Open the windows!" someone shouted as the smoke grew denser, burning throats and eyes. But the ancient church windows were set high in the walls beyond reach. Women began tearing strips from their clothing, soaking them with holy water from the font, and holding the damp cloths over their children's faces. The air grew increasingly unbreathable as the smoke filled the sacred space, transforming the church into a gas chamber. As panic spread, women and children pressed toward the altar and sacristy, hoping to find escape or cleaner air. The smoke was so thick that mothers lost sight of their children despite holding their hands. Coughing and choking filled the church as lungs fought for oxygen. Small children collapsed first, their smaller bodies succumbing more quickly to the toxic fumes. Then came the sound that would haunt Marguerite Roufanche for the remainder of her life. The distinctive crack of rifle fire as SS troops opened the doors and began shooting into the panicked crowd. Machine gun fire raked the interior of the church, cutting down women and children as they pressed toward the altar, seeking escape from the smoke. "Maman! Maman!" Hoarse children's cries pierced the chaos as bullets found their targets. Women threw themselves over their children in futile attempts to shield them from the gunfire. The stone floor of the church, worn smooth by centuries of worship, became slick with blood as bodies fell in heaps near the altar. In the chaos, Madame Roufanche spotted a small stepladder used by the church sacristan to light candles. With extraordinary presence of mind, she dragged it beneath a window behind the altar and climbed up, pulling her daughter with her. The window was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it offered the only possible escape. She helped her daughter climb onto the ledge, but as the young woman prepared to jump, she was struck by gunfire from below and fell back into the church, dying in her mother's arms. Roufanche, herself wounded by a bullet in her leg, managed to force her body through the narrow opening and drop approximately 3 meters to the ground outside. The impact sent sharp pain through her injured leg, but survival instinct drove her forward despite the agony. Behind her, the church had become an inferno as the Germans detonated additional incendiary devices. The screams from inside grew fewer and fainter as smoke and flames consumed the building and its occupants. Outside, she crawled painfully toward a nearby garden, concealing herself among rows of peas and beans. From this position, she watched as SS troops systematically moved through the village, looting homes before setting them ablaze. The methodical nature of the destruction was evident. This was not the chaotic violence of troops in combat, but the execution of a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate an entire community. Some women and children attempted to flee the church as the fire spread. Those who managed to reach the doors were met with machine gun fire, cut down on the church steps. Marie Avril, 23 years of age, emerged from the church carrying her infant son, only to be shot immediately by waiting SS troops. She fell forward, shielding her child's body with her own, even in death. A final gesture of maternal protection discovered later when investigators documented the scene. As evening approached, black smoke billowed from the church tower and from dozens of burning buildings throughout Oradour. The SS troops completed their assigned tasks with cold efficiency, removing valuables and destroying evidence before preparing to depart. They had spent less than 8 hours in the village, but had extinguished 642 lives and erased a community that had existed since medieval times. Young Roger Godfrey, the refugee boy from Lorraine, had escaped the roundup entirely through a combination of quick thinking and familiarity with German tactics. When he first saw the SS troops entering the schoolyard, he recognized their uniforms from his experiences in eastern France. Unlike his classmates, who had never experienced the brutality of German forces firsthand, Roger understood immediately what their presence might mean. While other children were being gathered, he slipped away through a back window and ran toward the woods beyond the village, hiding in underbrush until nightfall. His heart pounded so loudly he feared it might give away his position. As SS search parties moved through the area looking for escapees, he remained motionless for hours, not daring to move even when insects crawled across his skin. I knew what they were capable of, he would tell investigators years later. In Lorraine, I had seen them round up Jews and resistors. I knew when you see the SS, you run if you can. His prior experience with German occupation, the very reason his family had fled to central France seeking safety, had ironically given him the knowledge that saved his life. By 8 o'clock that evening, the SS convoy departed Oradour-sur-Glane, leaving behind only smoldering ruins and the dead. They carried with them looted valuables, watches, jewelry, currency, taken from homes and from the bodies of their victims. The village continued to burn throughout the night, flames visible from kilometers away, a beacon of atrocity in the French countryside. Sturmbannführer Diekmann reported the operation as a success to his commanding officer, Brigade Führer Heinz Lammerding. However, contrary to expectations, Lammerding was disturbed by the scale of the massacre, recognizing its potential to further inflame French resistance and create diplomatic complications. He ordered an SS court-martial investigation into Diekmann's actions, not from humanitarian concern, but from pragmatic consideration of the operation's impact on German strategic interests in France. The following morning, the first outsiders arrived to discover the full horror of what had occurred. French gendarmes from Limoges, responding to reports from escapees who had reached neighboring villages, entered a scene that defied description. Bodies lay where they had fallen, men in the barns and garages, women and children in the charred shell of the church. Many victims were burned beyond recognition, requiring identification through personal effects or dental records. The air still hung heavy with the smell of smoke and the unmistakable odor of burned flesh. Ash floated like gray snow through the ruined streets. Birds had gone silent, as if nature itself recoiled from the scene of human depravity. Even the most hardened gendarmes, men who had witnessed the brutalities of occupation for 4 years, found themselves overcome by what they discovered in Oradour. In the church, the scene was particularly harrowing. The bodies of women were found clustered around their children, having tried to shield them in their final moments. Infants remained in baby carriages, now reduced to blackened metal frames. Personal items, scattered amid the carnage, told individual stories of lives brutally cut short. A child's doll with its dress burned away. A woman's handbag containing family photographs, a small Bible with a handwritten inscription. One responding officer, a veteran of the Great War, was recorded as saying, "I have seen the aftermath of battles, but nothing prepared me for this. This was not warfare. This was extermination." He removed his kepi and stood bareheaded among the ruins, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. The systematic nature of the massacre became evident as investigators reconstructed the events. The SS troops had blocked all roads leading from the village before beginning their operation. They had separated the population by gender and age to prevent resistance. They had positioned their forces to ensure maximum casualties and minimum risk to themselves. Most tellingly, they had destroyed the village entirely, a clear indication that they never intended to leave witnesses or evidence. Dr. Claude Perrier, the regional medical examiner, arrived from Limoges to begin the grim task of documenting the dead. His official report, written in careful, professional language, nonetheless conveyed the horror he witnessed. Bodies exhibit evidence of systematic execution rather than combat casualties. Bullet wounds predominantly to the head and upper torso indicate deliberate targeting by trained marksmen. Burn patterns on victims in the church suggest they were alive when the fire began, as evidenced by smoke in the lungs and positioning that indicates attempts to escape the flames. News of the massacre spread quickly through occupied France and eventually to London, where the Free French government in exile under General Charles de Gaulle included it in radio broadcasts to demonstrate the brutality of Nazi occupation. The name Oradour became a watchword for civilian suffering, a symbol of the war's darkest aspects. The BBC French service broadcast detailed accounts of the massacre, ensuring that the crime would be known internationally. De Gaulle himself mentioned Oradour in a radio address, vowing that such atrocities would not go unpunished after liberation. "The martyrdom of Oradour stands as witness to the barbarism against which we fight," he declared. "When victory comes, as it surely will, justice will follow." For the perpetrators, consequences were mixed and often delayed. Adolf Diekmann, who had ordered the massacre, was killed in action in Normandy just weeks later, never facing justice for his actions at Oradour. Some viewed his death as convenient, sparing the German military leadership from having to address his actions through court-martial proceedings. Others saw it as insufficient justice for the scale of his crimes. Heinz Lammerding, the division commander who had ordered the court-martial investigation of Diekmann, survived the war and settled in West Germany. Despite being sentenced to death in absentia by a French military court in 1953, he was never extradited to face justice. Protected by the new West German government's reluctance to surrender its citizens for war crimes trials, he lived openly as a successful businessman until his death in 1971, never expressing remorse for the actions of his division in France. Other participating officers were captured after the war and stood trial in Bordeaux in 1953. The trial revealed an uncomfortable reality that further complicated France's post-war healing process. Among the SS men involved in the massacre were 14 Alsatians, French citizens who had been forcibly incorporated into the German military following the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine in 1940. The malgré nous, literally despite ourselves, were Alsatians conscripted against their will into German service. Their presence among the perpetrators created a moral and legal dilemma for French justice. Were they victims of German aggression themselves, forced to participate in atrocities under threat of execution? Or were they willing participants who had failed the test of moral courage? The court ultimately delivered lenient sentences to most defendants, particularly the Alsatians, creating bitter controversy in France that persists to the present day. Survivors and victims' families felt betrayed by what they perceived as political compromise trumping justice. The controversy reopened regional tensions between central France and Alsace, with protests in both regions following the verdicts. The French government made an extraordinary decision regarding Oradour-sur-Glane. Rather than clearing the ruins and rebuilding, they preserved the destroyed village exactly as it had been left on that June afternoon in 1944. President Charles de Gaulle himself visited the site in 1945 and declared it would remain untouched, a witness to the suffering of France under occupation and a reminder of what we must never allow to happen again. The streets where children once played remained strewn with debris. The burned-out shell of the church stood as a tomb and memorial. Rusted automobiles remained where they had been parked on that final Saturday. A decree signed by de Gaulle on May 10, 1946, officially designated the ruins as a historical monument, ensuring their preservation for future generations. A new village of Oradour was constructed nearby, but the original site became a permanent memorial, one of the most powerful and disturbing in Europe. Visitors walk silently through streets where signposts identify the former businesses and homes: baker, cafe, doctor's house. Inside the church, a simple plaque records the number of victims, including the 15 children under the age of 6 who perished in the flames. The decision to preserve rather than reconstruct represented a significant departure from standard post-war recovery practices. Throughout Europe, damaged towns and villages were being rapidly rebuilt, physical scars of the conflict erased in the push toward recovery and normalcy. Oradour stands in stark contrast, a deliberate choice to maintain the physical evidence of atrocity as a permanent reminder. In 1949, a more formal memorial center was established at the entrance to the ruined village. It houses photographs of the victims, artifacts recovered from the ruins, and historical context about the massacre. The contrast between these images of vibrant pre-war life and the silent ruins just beyond creates a powerful emotional impact that conventional monuments rarely achieve. Marguerite Roufanche, the only survivor from the church, testified at the Bordeaux trial and spent her remaining years ensuring the massacre would not be forgotten. Despite suffering ongoing physical pain from her injuries and the profound psychological trauma of having lost her entire family, she spoke with remarkable clarity and dignity about what she had witnessed. "I live to speak for those who can no longer speak," she told journalists shortly before her death in 1988. "I live to remember what humans are capable of doing to one another." Her detailed testimony provided crucial evidence about the systematic nature of the killings, particularly the deliberate targeting of women and children in the church. Robert Habris, who survived the barn executions, became a dedicated guardian of memory, guiding visitors through the ruins well into his 90s. Despite living with physical and emotional scars from that day, he spoke without hatred, focusing instead on the importance of remembrance as a bulwark against future atrocities. "I do not speak of revenge," he would tell groups of schoolchildren visiting the memorial. "I speak of remembrance. When you know what happened here, you carry a responsibility to prevent it from happening again." His ability to transform his personal trauma into educational purpose made him an extraordinary witness, connecting younger generations to historical events that might otherwise seem distant and abstract. Roger Godfrey, the schoolboy who escaped to the woods, carried a different kind of survivor's burden, what psychologists now recognize as survivor guilt. In interviews throughout his life, He repeatedly questioned why he had been spared when so many others, including his classmates and teachers, had perished. "Every time I return to Oradour, I see the faces of my friends who died that day," he told a French newspaper in 1997. "I wonder what lives they would have lived, what contributions they might have made. And I wonder why I was the one who ran when others stayed." Despite these struggles, Godfrey became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating young people about tolerance and the dangers of extremism. The question that haunts Oradour, why this particular village was targeted, remains incompletely answered even 8 decades later. The official SS claim that the village harbored resistance fighters was demonstrably false. The confusion with another similarly named location explains the initial selection, but not the scale and thoroughness of the destruction. Historians and survivors have proposed various explanations: a demonstration of power to intimidate the region, retaliation for resistance activities elsewhere, or most disturbingly, simply an opportunity for the SS troops to implement the extermination techniques they had perfected in Eastern Europe, where entire communities had been eliminated in similar operations. Sarah Farmer, a historian who conducted extensive research on the massacre, suggests in her book A Martyred Village that Oradour represented the collision of Eastern Front counterinsurgency tactics with Western European occupation policy. The massacre at Oradour was not an aberration, but rather the application of systematic methods developed for population control and terror in the East, she writes. What made it shocking to Western observers was not that such methods existed, but that they were employed against a Western European population that the Nazis themselves classified as racially closer to Germans than Eastern peoples. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Oradour massacre was its bureaucratic execution, the way it transformed murder into administrative procedure. The SS officers who directed the killings approached their task with the same organizational efficiency they might have applied to any military operation. They completed paperwork documenting the action, filed reports to superiors, and maintained the veneer of legitimate military activity while committing one of the war's most flagrant crimes against humanity. This transformation of atrocity into procedure reflects what philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil in her analysis of Nazi bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann, the capacity of ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes when those crimes are framed as administrative tasks and responsibility is diffused through organizational structures. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane stand today as France's most powerful monument to civilian suffering during the Second World War. Unlike traditional memorials that interpret and contextualize historical events, Oradour presents visitors with unmediated evidence, the physical reality of destruction preserved in stone and metal. Walking through its silent streets creates an immediacy that collapses the decades, making June 10th, 1944 feel unnervingly present. Visitors often report an uncanny silence that seems to hover over the ruins. Birds sing in the trees that have grown up around the village perimeter. But within the preserved streets, sound seems dampened, as if the place itself maintains a respectful quiet for those who died there. Wind moves through empty doorways and window frames, sometimes carrying the faint scent of wildflowers that have reclaimed small patches of ground between cobblestones. In the decades since the war, Oradour has received millions of visitors, including world leaders, schoolchildren, military personnel, and ordinary tourists. Each encounters the site differently, but few leave unmoved. Military historians note the tactical precision of the operation. Psychologists observe the impact of collective trauma on subsequent generations. Theologians contemplate questions of evil and remembrance in a place where the sacred and profane collided so violently. At the entrance to the ruined village, a simple inscription reads, Souviens-toi, remember. It is both plea and command, asking visitors to carry the memory of Oradour forward into a world that seems determined to forget the lessons of history. In an age when extremism and dehumanization again threaten civil society, Oradour's ruins speak with particular urgency. The preservation of Oradour has not been without controversy. Some questioned whether maintaining ruins merely perpetuates trauma rather than promoting healing. Others suggested that rebuilding would have demonstrated human resilience more effectively than preserving destruction. Even among survivors and victims' families, opinions varied about how best to honor the dead. Jean-Marcel Dartout, who survived the Lodi garage shootings, expressed ambivalence about the memorial. Sometimes I wonder if we should have rebuilt, created new life where death had been, but then I return to the ruins and feel the presence of those we lost, and I understand why it must remain as it is. Some wounds should not heal completely. The passage of time has created new challenges for the memorial. Physical deterioration threatens the ruins despite conservation efforts. The last direct witnesses are passing away, transforming living memory into a historical record. Digital technology has created opportunities to document the site through virtual reality and three-dimensional mapping, preserving it for future generations, even as the physical ruins gradually succumb to time. The story of Oradour-sur-Glane reminds us that civilization is fragile, that the veneer separating organized society from orchestrated barbarism can dissolve with terrifying speed. It demonstrates how ideology can transform educated men into methodical killers, how bureaucracy can normalize atrocity, and how quickly human lives can be reduced to statistics. The massacre at Oradour was not unique in the context of World War II. Similar atrocities occurred throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern territories where Nazi racial ideology classified populations as subhuman. Villages in Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, and Greece suffered comparable fates. What distinguishes Oradour is the preservation of evidence, the decision to maintain the physical reality of atrocity as testimony rather than allowing it to be buried beneath reconstruction. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is not an abstraction, but the sum of individual human experiences, 642 unique lives extinguished in a single afternoon, each with hopes. Memories and futures that ended in smoke and flame on a summer day in 1944. The tragedy of Oradour lies not only in the brutality of the massacre, but in the ordinariness of the lives it interrupted. These were not resistance fighters or political activists, but ordinary villagers whose greatest concern that morning had been the day's meals or the weather for the weekend. Their stories could have been the stories of countless villages throughout Europe. Stories of daily life, family connections, small pleasures, and common struggles, had violence not transformed them into symbols of wartime atrocity. As the generation of survivors and witnesses passes into history, the physical remains of Oradour-sur-Glane become increasingly precious as tangible evidence of what occurred there. In a world increasingly vulnerable to historical revisionism and denial, these ruins stand as irrefutable testimony, stones that cry out with a truth that cannot be silenced. When President Emmanuel Macron visited Oradour in 2018, he spoke of its continuing relevance. This place speaks not only of our past, but of our present and future. The forces that enabled such atrocities, intolerance, dehumanization of others, the surrender of individual moral responsibility to collective action, these forces remain present in our world today. Oradour stands as both warning and call to vigilance. The massacre at Oradour was not an aberration or the act of rogue units, but the logical extension of ideologies that classified some human lives as expendable. The same systems of thought that enabled the Holocaust manifested in this French village, demonstrating that nowhere in occupied Europe was truly safe from the machinery of extermination once it had been set in motion. For the families of victims, the pain of Oradour never truly ended. Decades after the massacre, descendants still gather annually on June 10th to walk in solemn procession through the ruined streets. Many French families can trace empty branches in their family trees back to that single afternoon. Grandparents never known, aunts and uncles whose lives ended before they could begin families of their own, cousins who never had the chance to be born. Camille Senon, who lost 36 family members in the massacre, but was herself saved by the coincidence of being in Limoges that day, devoted her entire life to preserving the memory of Oradour. The dead of Oradour have no graves where we can mourn them individually, on whom she observed in 1994. The entire village is their tomb, and we who survived are the keepers of their memory. Roger Godfrin, the schoolboy who escaped by running to the woods, carried the weight of survival throughout his life. "Why was I spared when so many others died?" he would ask in interviews given decades later. "I have tried to live a life worthy of this chance I was given." He died in 2001, having spent much of his life educating young people about the dangers of extremism and hatred. Robert Hebris, who survived by hiding under corpses in the Lodi garage, continued guiding visitors through the ruins until shortly before his death in 2023, at the age of 98. His final public statement, given on the 75th anniversary of the massacre in 2019, spoke to the universal implications of what had happened in his village. Oradour is not just about French suffering under German occupation. It is about what happens when we stop seeing each other as human beings, when ideology trumps compassion, when efficiency becomes more important than morality. The most profound legacy of Oradour-sur-Glane may be its role as a place of pilgrimage and reflection. Each year, hundreds of thousands of visitors walk its preserved streets, confronting questions about human nature, moral choice, and collective responsibility that have no easy answers. School groups from across Europe come to learn history not from textbooks, but from bullet-scarred walls and melted church bells. In the visitor center established adjacent to the ruins, photographs show Oradour as it was before June 10, 1944. A vibrant community where children played in the streets, where the café terraces filled on summer evenings, where life proceeded with the rhythms common to rural villages throughout France. This before image makes the after all the more devastating, highlighting not just what was destroyed, but what might have been. One particularly moving display features the personal effects recovered from victims: watches stopped at the moment of death, eyeglasses bent from falling bodies, wedding rings identified by engraved initials, a child's marble, a woman's comb. These ordinary objects, mundane in any other context, become profound in their ordinariness, tangible connections to individuals who were transformed from living humans to statistics in a single afternoon. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Oradour's memorial is that it requires visitors to actively engage rather than passively observe. There are no guided audio tours, no elaborate exhibits with interactive screens. Instead, there is silence and space, the opportunity to walk where victims walked, to see what they saw in their final hours, to stand in the physical space where atrocity occurred and confront one's own responses to that reality. As twilight falls across Oradour-sur-Glane each evening, the ruined village takes on an ethereal quality. Shadows deepen in doorways where families once gathered. Wind whispers through the burned-out church where mothers made their final stand protecting their children. The memorial becomes most powerful in these quiet moments, when the weight of absence is most palpable. In this stillness, Oradour offers its most important lesson, that remembrance is not passive but an active choice, one that requires courage and commitment. To remember Oradour is to acknowledge humanity's darkest potential while affirming the moral imperative to choose differently, to stand against the ideologies of dehumanization wherever they appear, and to recognize that the line between civilization and barbarism runs not between nations or peoples, but through every human heart. The story of what happened at Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10, 1944, is not merely historical record, but living memory, a wound in the collective consciousness that refuses to heal completely because it should not. Some injuries must remain tender, some memories must continue to disturb, if we are to honor our obligation to those who perished there and our responsibility to those who will come after us. In the final analysis, Oradour-sur-Glane stands as both warning and promise, a warning of what humans can do to one another when ideology trumps humanity, and a promise that as long as the ruins remain and the stories are told, those who died there will continue to speak their truth across the decades, calling us toward greater vigilance in defense of human dignity and the fragile miracle of civilized coexistence. The last light of day filters through the empty window frames of Oradour each evening, casting long shadows across cobblestones where children once played tag and hopscotch. A weathered doll's head, half buried in soil near what was once the village toy shop, stares skyward with a single glass eye, perhaps the most haunting of all artifacts that remain. French conservators have debated whether to remove such objects to museums, but ultimately decided that their power lies precisely in their context, in the undisturbed tableau of interrupted lives. During a commemoration ceremony in 2014, an elderly woman placed her palm against a bullet-scarred wall and closed her eyes. Marie-Jeanne Beaubreuil, 5 years old on that June day in 1944, had been saved by illness, a childhood fever that kept her home in neighboring Javerdette, while her cousins visited Oradour for a day trip. All 7 of them perished in the church. "I touched this wall," she whispered to a nearby journalist, "and I could feel their presence. Not their pain, their presence. This is how we defeat time and death. This is how we remember." The preservation of Oradour serves another essential purpose beyond remembrance. It stands as irrefutable evidence against denial. In an era when historical revisionism threatens to obscure the realities of the Second World War, these ruins offer concrete, physical testimony that cannot be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The melted bells of the church tower, the rusted chassis of Dr. Desourteaux's automobile, the scorched walls of the Laudy garage, these silent witnesses speak truths no document alone could convey with equal power. On still nights, local residents sometimes report a peculiar acoustic phenomenon, how sounds carry differently within the ruined village than in the surrounding countryside. A whisper near the church can sometimes be heard with unnatural clarity at the former schoolhouse hundreds of meters away. Physicists attribute this to the unique configuration of damaged walls and open spaces, creating unusual acoustic channels. But for many visitors, including some scientists, there remains something unsettling about how sound moves through Oradour, as if the village itself is trying to transmit messages across time. In 2020, during the temporary closure of the memorial site due to global pandemic restrictions, caretakers reported another curious phenomenon. Wildflowers bloomed in unprecedented profusion throughout the ruins, vibrant red poppies pushing through cracks in the stone, delicate white chamomile clustering around the church foundations, brilliant yellow calendula tracing the outlines of former gardens. Nature's reclamation of this place of death created a visual paradox so striking that when the memorial reopened, conservators made the controversial decision to allow some of these wild gardens to remain, rather than maintaining the sterile appearance of the immediate post-massacre landscape. The poet Paul Eluard, after visiting Oradour in 1946, wrote lines that are now inscribed at the memorial entrance. "Here eyes that once saw clearly, now see nothing but night. Here hands that once built homes, now lie forever still, but the heart does not forget, the heart does not surrender. and from these ruins, justice will bloom like spring flowers. The surprising wildflowers of 2020 seem to echo his prophecy across 7 decades. For the citizens of the new Oradour, built a kilometer away from the ruins, the relationship with the past remains complicated. Many families chose not to return after the war, unable to live in the shadow of such trauma. Those who did establish the new village have created a community that simultaneously honors the past while refusing to be defined solely by tragedy. The new Oradour has its own identity, with schools, businesses, and a vibrant civic life, yet remains inextricably connected to the ruins that draw hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Claude Millord, mayor of New Oradour from 2008 until 2020, described this dual identity. We are both keepers of memory and creators of future. Our community bears the heaviest name in France, a name synonymous with suffering. But we are also living people with dreams and hopes. Our greatest achievement has been to create a place where children can grow up knowing the truth of what happened without being crushed by its weight. This delicate balance between remembrance and resilience represents perhaps the most profound lesson of Oradour today. The massacre showed humanity at its worst, systematic, calculated cruelty implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. But the response to that horror, the determination to preserve truth, to build new life without forgetting the old, to transform trauma into educational purpose, demonstrates humanity's capacity for moral courage and regeneration. As first light touches the ruins each morning, birds sing from nests built in the hollow spaces of what were once family homes. Wild roses climb walls that once contained human dreams. Butterflies move through sunbeams that cross empty doorways. Nature does not erase the past, but rather incorporates it into new cycles of life, perhaps the most hopeful metaphor Oradour offers us. In the end, the most powerful testament to Oradour's enduring significance may be the silence that falls over visitors as they walk its streets. Scholars have documented how even the most talkative tour groups fall quiet within minutes of entering the ruins. Children stop fidgeting. Teenagers put away their phones. Something in this place cuts through the distractions of modern life and demands full presence, a rare quality in our fragmented age. This quality of attention, this capacity to be fully present with historical trauma without turning away, may be Oradour's greatest gift to those who come here. In a world increasingly characterized by distraction and amnesia, the ruins teach us how to remember, not with hatred or vengeance, but with the solemn recognition that humanity's darkest capabilities require our constant vigilance and our most determined resistance. As Robert Hebres, one of the last survivors, told a group of students shortly before his death, "I have returned to this place thousands of times. I have guided presidents and schoolchildren through these streets. People always ask how I can bear to come back. The truth is, I never left. None of us survivors ever truly left Oradour. But we learned to carry it differently, not as a burden that crushes, but as a testimony that enlightens. That is what I hope you will take from this place, not just the knowledge of what happened, but the responsibility of remembering it clearly, so that no child, anywhere, will ever again have to run from men who have forgotten their own humanity."